This episode of Red Menace was recorded on August 25th, 2020.
Hello everyone, you are listening to Red Menace, and we are here this month for another one of our current events episodes. So if you don't know, we're a podcast that got started off primarily by doing summaries of left-wing and revolutionary theory, and while we still do that, we now alternate every month between discussing that kind of theory and discussing various current events, because obviously as we have moved into 2020, we've all seen how much of a shit show this year is, and there is quite a lot to talk about that needs to be discussed, and it's our opinion that theory is not something that just stays in the past, but it's something that has, implications for where we're on now, and it would be a failure on our project in some ways not to sort of embrace the current moment and to deal with it. So we today are going to be talking about a bunch of things that are happening right now, and next month we are going to be going back to a theory episode, and for this one we're going to do things a little bit differently. Instead of focusing in on a specific text next month, we're going to go ahead and do sort of a Marxism 101, because obviously the current conditions right now have a lot of people interested in Marxism and theory more broadly, and we think that we can provide some insights there. So we're going to go ahead and do a slightly different episode, but with a still theoretical focus next month, and we really look forward to hearing from you all. So with that said, we have a number of things that we want to get into today. It's when you're looking at the last few months of 2020, it's almost hard to figure out where to start. And despite the fact that there are many, many things happening, there's still an election going on. And that election is going in very interesting and very strange directions. And we've gotten into debates about elections, electoralism, all of that, plenty. And we're not really interested in approaching things from that perspective, but we do want to talk about the election a little bit. There's a lot going on. So on one level, obviously, we have Biden and Trump, which is a pairing that a lot of people aren't happy with. And we're seeing interesting consolidations that are happening as a lot of Republicans are going to the Biden side of things, and as progressives and leftists obviously abhor Biden in many ways. And we are also seeing a full-blown assault on the election in terms of the Trump administration trying to disrupt the ability to vote by mail going on, and that is, itself turning into a bit of a disaster. So we want to go ahead and jump into all those topics right now and just sort of get into what's going on with this election, where it could possibly go, and how we should be analyzing it as Marxists. So do you have any thoughts that you want to open with, Brett, or do you want to just jump right into all that?
Yeah, I have some thoughts I could probably open with. One of the things, maybe a good place to start, is to think about what the possible outcomes were. Now, a month ago, we were looking at polls that showed Joe Biden with an absolutely historic advantage in the polls over Trump. And, for a good solid month, as if nobody learns anything from previous elections, everybody was convinced that Biden is definitely going to run away with this one. And Kamala Harris was seen as a safe, sort of savvy pick to sort of appease the representational elements of the left liberal base, while also putting forth somebody with experience and that is, could be seen as somewhat attractive to moderates, even though, of course, Fox News is calling her a communist and whatnot. But that just speaks to the deficiencies and the strategic abilities of the Democrats. But one thing I do want to say, and because the polls have shifted, right? I mean, now we're seeing Trump catch up. He's within the margin of error. And so all those, those sort of triumphalist accounts of polling a month ago, or, nobody's talking about it anymore. It's back to being a neck-and-neck race. And I've traveled a little bit this summer. I went on a couple family vacations just sort of around the Midwest. I went to the Lake of Ozarks, for example, in Missouri. And then I went out to rural Nebraska on a small family trip. And then I went to see my friend in Seattle and in Washington. And so one thing I noticed, and take this for what it's worth, and I would love to get to your thoughts on this as well as far as what this means, but Trump signs everywhere. I mean, obviously inside of Seattle, you don't see it, but we went out into the peninsula, out into rural Washington, saw them everywhere. On just the trip between like Omaha and Lincoln, a 45-minute trip, you see these signs everywhere. When you go into campgrounds, I've been to several campgrounds this year, like RVs parked with Trump flags, boats flying by with Trump flags. Obviously in Missouri, going down to the Ozarks, I mean, it's just Trump country in the white South. And then Biden signs this entire time, even in fucking Seattle, I don't see anything for Biden. I think I've seen one sign in a neighboring neighborhood that I live in, and it wasn't even a pro-Biden sign. It just said, vote Democrats 2020. So it wasn't even a full-fledged support of Biden himself. And so I'm not exactly sure what that means, but one thing I think it absolutely means is, like, don't fall into the trap of 2016 where people were absolutely convinced Hillary was going to win. This time I think it's just as much up in the air, especially with the Electoral College still in play. Biden not being very exciting and energizing to left or apolitical or people who've been left behind by the political scene, so it's really just a Democratic base. And maybe, they're trying again with, like, how many Republican moderates can we get, as if that strategy didn't just blow them out of the water last time.
Right.
That's an initial way in, and then I'll get to talking about the reactions to possible scenarios of the election. But do you have anything to say with regards to signs and polls and where we're at with regards to any of that?
Yeah, so interestingly, I think that I have also only seen one sign for the Democrat side, and I live in, a very progressive area, so that was sort of surprising to see. You're right, just a total absence of that in a lot of ways, which has been strange. And I think that reflects, when we think about the polls, there are various aspects of what's being polled. So a lot of what we've been looking at has been approval ratings in swing states. So what is the approval of Biden in Pennsylvania versus what is the approval of Trump in Pennsylvania, rather than predictors of who someone's going to vote for. And there's obviously other factors that we need to take into account. And one of the places that Biden has really struggled, and this kind of makes sense with this whole not really seeing signs and stuff like that, is with polling about voter enthusiasm, right? So the people who support Trump are very enthusiastic and very excited about the opportunity to vote for Trump. And Biden has been struggling to match Trump on those numbers in terms of voter enthusiasm, which kind of makes sense, right? Biden is the compromise pick. He was not even a lot of moderates' first choice. Many of the moderates wanted Klobuchar, or they wanted Buttigieg or someone like that. So, as the compromise candidate, it makes some sense that there is some struggle that he's having with enthusiasm. But that was sort of one big thing that I think a lot of people have had to sort of take into account, is that even if Biden is leading in approval polls, which again, like you said a few weeks ago, he was quite ahead and those have narrowed now, he's not been able to pull those kind of leads in terms of enthusiasm, and that's probably what we're seeing spill over into the street. And I think that reflects, two very, very, very different campaign strategies, right? The Trump campaign strategy is about his core base. Like, if you watch the speeches from the Republican National Convention, like, they're not talking about policy. They're not talking about the things they want to do. It is just a rally for that core base. And it makes sense that would spark enthusiasm, right? The Trump base is very enthusiastic. We've seen that over and over again. More than other Republican bases, they're willing to get out to the street and protest, take action. So that should not be surprising to us at all. Whereas the Biden appeal, like you said, has actually not really been towards the core Democratic base, but similar to what Hillary did towards moderate Republicans. And I don't know where I land on what the prospects for Biden are. I actually think that I still, if I had to put money on it, would bet Biden at this point. Partially because I think that Biden is succeeding sort of on a level that Hillary wasn't in terms of pulling Republicans over. So the really fascinating thing, right, is that Biden has, pulled in a lot of big name Republicans for the Democratic National Convention and now this Republican for Biden group in a way that Hillary wasn't quite able to. And the question that kind of is an unknown in my mind is how many voters give a shit about that? How many moderate Republicans really are there? Biden, I think, has done a better job of getting establishment neoconservative Republicans to approve of him than Hillary did. But what that will mean about mobilization at the polls is kind of up in the air and hard to see. Is the Republican base around Trump the large, so large that is all Trump needs? Does he not need the moderates? That's kind of what Trump seems to be betting on right now. And we won't find out until not even November, because there's not going to be a real election night this year, until all the mail ballots are in, essentially. But definitely, Biden seems to be deploying that strategy better than Hillary, but I just don't know if that strategy corresponds to actual voters.
Yeah, it's tough because, while Biden might be getting some big name Republicans, it's like, that's a shrinking pool of legitimacy. Those voices, those establishment elites, no longer represent constituencies in the electorate like they did in the 90s and even early 2000s. There's been a real delegitimization of the state on both sides, on the right and the left. And while Trump is doubling down on that right-wing energy, the Democrats do what they always do, which is just they want to be the Republican Party. They think they can be a better version of the Republicans than the Republicans, and so they go to try to pick off these Republicans. And sure, some big names are coming, but for every big name Republican, like, what chunk of the electorate is that really speaking to?
Right.
Does that really represent? And so I think we're in this time where we really haven't been in our entire lives, where the state is just so delegitimized on both sides that I just don't think that carries the weight that it used to. And I think it's so far up in the air. If I had to put money, I mean, a month ago it would have been 100% Biden. Now I really could flip a coin. Like, I am just not convinced that we're going to see the sort of turnout that the Democrats expect. I think a lot of people, instead of looking at the incompetence of Trump and saying, "Oh, I need to go vote for the Democrat," might just be like, "Fuck this entire system. I'm staying home." That's just as valid of a reaction to Trump as voting for fucking shitty-ass Biden and Harris 2020. So yeah, it's a lot of that remains to be seen, but I do think there's been a shift towards delegitimized state, and I think that gets us into this next area. Oh, really quick, because we're going to talk about mail voting in a second, but I also think a lot of it comes down to how much the Republicans can suppress the vote.
Right.
If they succeed during a pandemic, if they can really make a dent in mail and they can delegitimize it, and Trump's already setting up the rhetorical framework to say it's a rigged election in the first place, what does all that stuff mean? How will that play out? Where will people be in early November, late October, compared to where we are now? It's like, who fucking knows? It's 2020. Anything could happen. But I want to talk, before we get into the mail stuff, which you have some stuff to say on, I want to talk about the reaction to either scenario. So let's sort of play it out a little bit. Let's say Trump wins, right? In a similar situation, which if he does win, I think it will be similar to 2016 in that the popular vote goes to Biden by however many millions, but the Electoral College gets Trump over the finish line. Voter turnout is suppressed just enough for Trump to get that technical victory. We saw what happened in 2016 before we even knew how Trump governed, which was huge protests, J20, riots in the streets. I was involved in dozens of protests with hundreds and hundreds of people in this medium-sized city taken to the streets over and over and over again. And we didn't even get 4 years of the disastrousness that is a Trump presidency. We just knew that it was going to be fucking bad. And so this time I truly believe, especially with all the energy coming out of Black Lives Matter, of these riots, of these lootings, people are really getting accustomed to burning shit down and breaking fucking windows and looting fucking stores in a way that even a few years ago was really very rare on the American scene. So I think that if Trump does win, you're going to have a reaction from the left and the liberals in this country that I think we've never quite seen. I don't exactly know how that will play out. There will definitely be huge riots. I think there will be huge marches, huge protests. We had the Women's March last time. We had a bunch of, marches for a bunch of different reasons, and that's just going to be tripled, this time. I think a lot of people are sick of Trump, but does that cash out in terms of support for Democrats? I don't actually think so. Now, the flip side, Biden wins, let's say by a very small margin. Trump's already laying the groundwork for calling it a rigged election. The right wing doesn't have as many numbers. Like, when a cop kills a black man, I mean, every city erupts, right? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people respond. When you have Trump rallies, it's significantly smaller than that, but it's much more armed. It's much more likely to turn into terrorist attacks as opposed to mass movements. And so if you have a huge QAnon or QAnon adjacent constituency, which is totally in la-la land, you have Trump laying the foundations to call it rigged if and when he loses. You have people already on Fox News and mainstream right-wing outsources trying to make Biden and Kamala out to be hardcore communists and proxies and puppets of Antifa. So, you have half the country with their brains absolutely melted. How will that play out? I mean, I think I see a country bursting at the seams in ways that it almost never has. And you go back to, obviously, the Civil War, but, most of us go back to the 60s and say, well, the 60s were like this. In fact, we had more political assassinations in the 60s. So what we're going through right now is like maybe as bad as the 60s or maybe even not as bad as the 60s. But I think the fundamental difference there is the legitimacy of the state. I still think in the 60s you had relative economic prosperity, although obviously it's never been shared in white supremacist settler colonial America, but you had relative prosperity. You didn't have, obviously, a huge pandemic. pandemic, you had most people still believing in the power of the state. Even black civil rights movements like Martin Luther King's more peaceful, nonviolent approach was really trying to have a redress of grievances within the democratic processes of the state, seeing the state as still a legitimate mechanism through which to find change. And I just don't think the state has that level of legitimacy anymore. And so the pressures that America was put under in the 60s was survived partially by that generalized legitimacy the state still had and that relative economic prosperity and the ideas that our best days might still be ahead of us. And that's just not present anymore. So I think we're actually in a more either revolutionary or crisis-prone state, however you want to phrase it, than we were in the 60s, even given the differences. And so I think maybe Joe Biden wins by a huge fucking blowout, that we have a peaceful transition to a new presidency or something, and the state can stumble by a few more years or something. But I don't see it being a blowout on either side, and I see that the sort of pins already being set up for chaos in the streets one way or the other. What are your thoughts, Alyson?
Yeah, I think I generally agree with that outlook. In terms of like breaking down both scenarios, if Trump wins, I think the way that I look at it to a certain extent is that, probably there will be a repeat of sort of the J20 type of movement. I think you're right. We'll see a lot of marches. We'll see a lot of that same energy out there. The question for me this time is like, and this gets at that delegitimization question, if Trump wins on a, electoral college without the popular vote again, at what point is that going to disillusion more and more liberals, right? Because that's sort of the thing, is I think that a number of liberals did become disillusioned in 2016. To a certain extent, like the growth of like socialism and even of like, more broadly defined like social democracy did kind of have to do with people sort of feeling like 2016 was some bullshit. And there was definitely some disillusionment. But I think what we're seeing right now going into this election season is at the end of the day, most of those liberals still believe democracy exists right now and that the Democrats are a way of making things work, even if they're mad about Bernie getting fucked over. And you just have to wonder at the point that, another popular vote, just gets ignored, is that going to be the breaking point for people? And I think that's the question that will largely determine whether or not the point of crises in the case of a Trump win, again, will go beyond what we saw in 2016, is whether or not, your average sort of progressive liberal is just going to say, okay, it doesn't matter. Like, we got people out there. We did everything we could during the pandemic. We mobilized, we got the votes, and we still lost. And there's a level of demoralization there that I think is really intense. And whether or not, that is going to be just a breaking point for people, I think is going to be the primary question. And so that, I think, is what we'll have to wait to see. I really do think you're right, though. If Trump wins it again, my guess is he loses the popular vote, he gets the electoral college, and I do think that'll be a breaking point for some people. I really do, especially, like, thinking about progressives who campaigned for Bernie, got outmaneuvered by the Democrats, and then who, many of them are going on to campaign for the Democrats still, and might get outmaneuvered by the Electoral College. There's such a level of compounding frustration there that I think could create, a very fundamentally different situation than what we saw in 2016. So that's why I think that things are more crisis-prone on that side of things. If Biden wins, that's the scenario I'm more concerned about in a lot of ways, because like you said, I think what we'll see from the right is going to be a lot scarier than what we'll see from the left. When the left gets out there and protests, yes, we see, all sorts of, like, tactics that are deployed, property destruction happens, but people aren't dying. And what I'm more scared about is a context in which Biden wins, probably not by very much at all, would be my guess. If Biden wins, it's going to be close either way. And, that is going to create a right-wing reaction that I find absolutely terrifying as a possibility. There's people who are talking about whether or not Trump will step down or not. And, from my perspective, I think, like, if there will probably be a bunch of nightmare legal battles with no precedent this year, no matter what. But in the end, I think that if it looks like Biden won, Trump will leave the White House. I don't think he wants to get forcibly removed. But all that rhetoric priming his people for it being an illegitimate or rigged election in some way or another is just perfectly setting things up to justify violence from his right-wing base, who, again, is far more armed and is far more prone to attacking people instead of property. And so that, I think, is, the really scary scenario. If Trump wins again, I think there will be unrest as a result of that, but not as scary as the unrest as if we get a Biden win. So that's kind of how I'm looking at that, at least.
Yeah, and it's so sad how much of this political rippling effect is really just premised on Trump's sort of ego, because fucking Trump has to be miserable. I mean, Trump can't really enjoy this, but his ego needs to make him a second-term president, regardless, because, first-term presidents are losers, and I'm not a loser, I'm a winner. So he's already laying the groundwork so that if he does lose, it's really an ego narcissistic thing where it's like, I didn't really lose. It was rigged, obviously. These are all, far-left radical Democrats. So it's not even like Trump is thinking strategically about mobilizing the right in attack of the left. It's just like Trump's belligerent, stumbling, incoherent, egoic, narcissistic impulses at every moment, because he's been able to climb to this position in society through white supremacy and just the depravities of settler colonial America. It's really the machinations of his narcissism have so much effect on millions of people's lives. It's fucking grotesque in that way. That's not saying anything new, but I just don't think that Trump is a calculating, strategizing fascist. I think he's an utter narcissist, but because there's this fascistic personality cult on the right, Trump's narcissism and his ego becomes American politics, and it's fucking horrific.
Yeah, and I think that question of, is Trump a calculating fascist or is he an egomaniac actually raises one of the smaller points that I wanted to bring up, which is sort of Richard Spencer.
Oh, yeah.
And his relation to the election. Because I don't know if people have seen, but Richard Spencer has endorsed Biden and has basically, there were several tweets that he made where he got at this. The first was he kind of hinted at his general support for Biden by saying that he believes that Harris and Biden would crack down on leftist organizing more harshly than Trump would, was sort of his first indication. And then sort of later on, when asked more about it, he basically said that the Republican Party is full of incompetent grifters and that at least the Democrats have competency. And so because of that, he would be voting on a straight Biden ticket. So, Richard Spencer, this very, very avowed far-right fascist figure, making this perspective on supporting Biden. I think it is interesting, right? Because there's this question of okay, is Richard Spencer trolling?
Yeah.
Is this just trying to get attention, get a rise, or is he serious about this? And sort of, what does that say about Biden? And to a certain degree, I don't know that I agree with Richard Spencer that Biden would crack down more harshly than Trump would. I think a crackdown is coming no matter what, on a certain level. But what he's getting at, I think, is interesting, right? Which is he's saying, for whatever the ideological distinction between Biden and Trump, at least the Democrats aren't sort of unhinged narcissists in the same way, who are acting based on personal impulse rather than based on, policy making. And so there's sort of this competency thing that he's getting at. And it's sort of a comrade was talking about this in the context of who was invited to the Republican National Convention, with the Republican National Convention having invited that couple in St. Louis who had been brandishing weapons and a bunch of other very fringe figures, a comrade was saying it's very clear that the Republicans have sort of allied around a unhinged kind of populism that in a lot of ways no longer has an appeal to sort of fascist figures like Spencer who want competency in their government repression. And maybe that could be why we've seen that move towards Biden. Whether or not Biden is representative of fascism in the way that Spencer wants, there's at least a control to it that he approves of. But I don't know, I'm interested in your take on what Spencer's endorsement means.
It's hard to say. On one level, I mean, there are people out there saying that he's trolling. It's an intention thing, but it's also Biden gets the endorsement of a Nazi. Is it hurting the Democrats to have that sort of endorsement? I mean, when Joe Rogan endorsed Bernie, it was a big deal. Why is Richard Spencer endorsing Biden not an equally sized deal? Maybe there's some trolling there of just trying to sow discord and confusion and play on already existing riffs. But on the other hand, insofar as there are a section of fascists who really come out of American empire, believe in America and Western civ as a sort of, the sort of fairy tale of we conquered and we deserve and we own, and America is, ours, the white man's. I could see a fascist reasoning taking them to saying anything that stabilizes the American empire is better than things that destabilize it, but there's also fascists who are, eco-fascist or, boogaloo boys who are all about the breaking down of America and the subsequent race war or whatever fucking weird shit they have in their heads about what comes next. So it's really hard to say. I don't know. I don't want to spend time in Richard Spencer's mind. I don't know what his ultimate game here is. If I had to guess, I might lean towards trolling, but I mean, it's really hard to say. I don't really have strong opinions on this. It is a very interesting and just topsy-turvy world we're living in 2020, and this is really like a cherry on top of all the chaos.
Yeah, no, it's really wild. It's just sort of interesting because I've seen a lot of people trying to figure out exactly what it all means, and it is an interesting question to try to wrestle with. So the one other thing about the election that I kind of wanted to get into a little bit that I think, might be somewhat interesting to wrestle with is the question of what's going on with the mail, right? So obviously one of sort of the big things that we've seen going on has been the disruption of the mail and an attempt to make it difficult to vote by mail because the pandemic obviously means that, people are not necessarily going to be comfortable voting in person for very obvious reasons, and a lot of states are trying to pivot towards a vote-by-mail system. And this has been in the news. I'm sure you are all familiar with this. The post office has, sort of started to be gutted with the removal of sorting machines that were necessary in order for mail to get sorted in a reasonable fashion. In addition to that, they have been getting rid of overtime and the ability for people to work longer hours to get mail out on time. There's been stories of mail being left on the floor of mail rooms instead of actually going out on the day that's supposed to get delivered. And we've seen, a huge amount of controversy around this, with the Senate actually bringing in the head of the post office, who is a big Trump supporter, and sort of grilling him over this. And there's a couple interesting points, I think, about the mail disruption that's going on right now. I think on the one hand, it's an example of just how much, the idea that America is a country governed by the rule of law is not true. To a certain extent, one of the questions with this election, right, is what's going to happen? And a lot of liberals want to say, well, here are the laws that can govern things and make things work out in a way that is properly democratic. But I think this shows how little those laws matter, right? Technically, the post office isn't doing anything illegal. No laws are being broken by getting rid of the infrastructure needed to create vote by mail and to functionally create voter suppression. But obviously, they still serve those ends, right? And it's a good example, I think, of the way that this idea that, liberal norms and laws can check back against the encroach of fascist governing styles just is untrue to a very large extent. American democracy, obviously, has always been a sham in various ways. It has always had exclusions built into it, and voter suppression has always been there. But here we see sort of a more generalized voter suppression, not at specific demographics, but at sort of the country on the whole. And, there's not really anything legally to be done about it. The Democrats are rushing to try to get funding passed, but whether or not the Republicans would pass that funding and Trump wouldn't veto it is a whole other question. And it is just an example of how much, you can have all the laws in the world, you can have all the liberal norms about how things should function, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a real functioning democracy. And we're seeing that very clearly right now.
Yeah.
The one other thing with mail that I thought was interesting, that maybe gets to some hope in the situation, was that apparently mail workers in Dallas and Tacoma have begun refusing orders to tear down those sorting machines and stop using them and to let the mail pile up. And I just want to touch on that a little bit, I think, because this is a level of this crisis that doesn't always get talked about. But I think it's such a concrete example of the extent to which ultimately, power is in the hands of workers, right? This is the thing that we as Marxists always say, which is that workers don't need the bosses need the workers to implement their control. And that's a prime example of how, maybe laws cannot disrupt this kind of thing. The legal process and the Senate are helpful, but workers just refusing to go along with it actually has done more than, Nancy Pelosi has been able to do on the question. And it's a nice reminder to us of where power actually lies in terms of these struggles that are happening right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes you think about choke points in an economy and how workers strategically placed in certain industries, when certain crises hit, become all the more important and actually have more power infused in them. Something like longshoremen, dock worker unloaders, which we did an episode on Rev Left about, is an obvious choke point for workers to carry out actions. And in history, they've been carried out in favor of class struggle for workers and racial justice fights, etc. And here we're seeing something similar, obviously smaller, but something showing the workers do have a lot of power here. And there's a double-edged sword that the Republicans are playing with here. Because on one hand, they want to demonize the USPS, they want to cut it. They've always been trying to get rid of it. They want all public things to be privatized. And so that's been a long-running thing. But on the same side of that token, so many of their voters are rural, older people who, one, because they're older, get a lot of their shit done by mail, right? They're not online or in fucking 4chan forums. And secondly, they live in rural areas where only USPS will deliver, at least at good prices, because privatized companies are like, why the fuck would I go out into the middle of Nebraska to deliver 3 packages? While we're going to charge you a fuck ton of money to even make that trip, etc. So that they're sort of playing a dangerous game here because there's so many old, rural voters that make up the Republican base. But they are doubling down on a long time sort of fraud on behalf of the Republicans, which is they say that the Democrats are engaged in voter fraud so that they can take extreme actions to suppress the vote. So it's like a classic case of blaming the other person for what you're actually trying to do. And they want to take out USPS because in this election, given the pandemic, they know that it will allow many more people to vote much more easily. And Republicans, generally speaking, know that the more people that show up to vote, the worse it is for their chances of winning. So they're sort of balancing these two different things, and we're going to continue to see how that plays out. The one reason that they have to continue to try to suppress the vote and do everything they can, from gerrymandering to destroying the USPS, to do it, is because the Republican Party is a party now almost entirely based on white grievance. And we have a demographic shift happening in this country where the white majority is slowly being eaten away at. And I think it's now 50% of children under 15 in America are non-white. And for the Republicans to exist as they currently exist, they have to maintain that sort of base of angry whiteness, which makes up almost their entire political identity in a lot of ways, plus, pro-capital economic policies, etc. But yeah, the more those demographics shift towards non-whiteness, and the more the Republicans want to hold on to white resentment as a backbone of their party, the more they're going to have to engage in chicanery of this type to repress voter turnout and to amplify whatever little powers they have. This is a shrinking minority of people knowing they're going the wrong way with demographics and struggling to keep on to power by any means that they possibly can. And when those means conflict with democracy or basic human decency or law and order or any of the things they claim to care about, that shit just goes out the window. It's really about power. And when the Republicans a few years ago talking about how much they believe in the Constitution and liberty and freedom and all these things, it's just like that shit goes out the window whenever it's inconvenient for them. So this is an interesting development. It'll continue to play out, and I'm interested to see where it goes. What do you think about any of that?
Yeah, so I agree with your perspective, and I think this complicates some of the questions that we were asking earlier, right? So the question of, who's going to win and do the polls matter at all kind of assume that a fair election happens, and it's just not clear at this moment that that is going to be the case. And I think you're right that demographic shifts obviously are forcing the Republicans into this kind of action, and I think that all is what contributes to at least my sense that there is a crisis occurring right now that is sort of unprecedented, because again, regardless of who wins, this question is going to be called into account by either side. And the level of just distrust in the process that's come from this mail-in voting situation, that's come from Trump's, rhetoric about this being an illegitimate election, no matter what, is going to put us in a position where I think no one's going to trust these results very much. The other component that I think is going to be tricky that some people have talked about is that there's not going to be an election night this year, right? So usually you have an election night where the election is preliminarily at least called once all the polls closed and everything has been collected, but because those votes are going to be coming in at different times, there's not going to be one clear moment where we can call it. So there's going to be a period of ambiguity in November that is going to be very new and hard to deal with, and what that means in terms of crisis I think is also going to be very hard to figure out. I don't know when we'll even know who won the election necessarily.
We are so fucked.
Yeah, it's pretty scary, frankly.
Absolutely. Okay, well, this leads nice into this last part of the American elections, then we'll move on to other topics. But, I've been wrestling with this idea. I haven't really sharpened it against other comrades too much, so I'd love to hear, your thoughts, Alyson, and if listeners want to write in on Patreon or in any way you can get a hold of us and let you know your opinions, I'd love to listen to those as well. But what I really see is 4 main paths that the U.S. can go from here, and I'm talking over the next 2 to 5 decades. So, not over the next several months, but over the next several decades, but well within this century, of course, and our lifetimes. Where does America go from here? And I think there's 4 main paths. the one path and the best for people who believe in the system or want to maintain it is massive reform. And this would look something like social democracy, of America moving beyond a lot of where we're at right now, the system realizing it's systematically being delegitimized, younger people coming up into the system that actually move the Democratic Party left and speak to a broader electorate, genuine wealth redistribution, aggressive climate change policies, concrete material steps to address the systematic and institutional racism in our society, right? Basic things that take the pressure off, that sort of, not solve the contradictions, because that's impossible in the current system, right, but prolong its life in a similar way like the New Deal did, right? For all of its failures, it was really a re-entrenchment of the system, taking, pretty radical steps at that time to guarantee its continuance and perpetuity. Mm-hmm. And we're at another moment like that of deep crisis where it doesn't look like the system has any intentions of moving in that direction. I mean, the Democrats are hostile to Bernie like he's fucking Stalin. But that is one possible road that could happen. And for that to happen, both major parties would have to be radically transformed. And I don't think you can leave the two parties as they exist right now and get to the sort of depth of reform that would be necessary to prolong this system's overall life. So that's one path. Not a very promising one in my opinion. The second one, which is one we've talked about on the show, I think, between you and I, Alyson, is the idea of balkanization, where you can imagine different crises, but let's just take the obvious climate crises happening, piling up. The federal government, much like it's been doing during COVID, just doesn't really show up. Continues to lose legitimacy, fractures in part or fails totally, and we basically go to regional governments, state governance, something on the level, but the U.S. Nation state as an entity is either drastically reduced, fractured, or completely in a state of failure. That's another possible path, balkanization. The third one is something like civil war and or a fascist takeover. I think the two would go similarly hand in hand. And as I was telling Alyson before we recorded, I don't mean civil war and like the Union versus the Confederates of like people in uniforms across battle lines or anything like that. But I mean just a continual sort of social collapse and decay. Fighting in the street, terrorist attacks, the government desperate to maintain legitimacy but not willing to do the big massive reforms necessary to actually maintain that legitimacy will have to resort to repression, which in a white supremacist settler colonial nation state can only be fascism. And so I think those two will likely go together. And when you look around the country right now, major cities continuing to be on fire, the state continuing to put bullets into unarmed black people, huge divisions, the legitimacy of the state in deep question on both sides of the arena. We're in a really divisive crisis time right now in America, and to think that it could not lead to civil war, I think, or something like civil war and breakdown and then a fascist government repression, I think is naive. That's a very possible and even plausible, I think, perhaps even the most plausible route. And then my fourth option is obviously the best case scenario, which is something like a revolution that fundamentally rejects capitalism, understands the connections between capitalism, racism, imperialism, climate change, and takes massive revolutionary steps to radically transform our economic and political institutions in this country, and hopefully spread something like that revolution around the region and possibly even the world. And for that scenario to happen, the demographic shifts would have to continue. The right wing in this country would have to be continually reduced in number, right? There would have to be a sort of number shift towards the left that would allow for a revolution to take place, because I think right now those numbers just aren't there, and the backlash would be very powerful given that the right has not only paramilitary and outside the state domination with regards to higher weaponries and access to like institutions, but also just fully instituted into like the Republican Party, the policing, the military, etc. So yeah, those are my four. I really don't see any other path. One thing I know for a fact is America cannot just continue. And anybody who, it's like a sort of a liberal fever dream fantasy to assume that America can just trudge on like it is now and exist, more or less the same for the next several days. That's just not in the cards, in my opinion.
Right.
Do you find anything wrong with my four futures? Do you have any extra ones to add? Do you think that I'm wrong in suggesting that America as it currently is, more or less, could not continue on for several decades?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're pretty much correct. I think that we said this in our first episode on COVID, there's not going back to a time before this crisis, I think. And it is very clear in terms of why people support Biden, why people support various forms of liberalism, that there is a desire for a lot of people to, like, let's go back to 2011, right? Like, middle of Obama era, things were pretty okay. We all felt pretty okay about them domestically. But that's not going to happen. And I think that is very, very clear. Coronavirus, I think, in a lot of ways, right, has really, really shown the limits of the political system that we live in. And, we're seeing that in terms of the election breaking down. We're seeing that in terms of massive unemployment. We're seeing that in terms of the Democrats and the Republicans not even being able to get out a fucking second stimulus check. It is so incredibly obvious that we are at a point of crisis that is breaking everything down. And it's sort of interesting to, subjectively at least, it was sort of interesting to watch things happen back in April, right? Everything felt new, and it was sort of like, okay, we'll see what happens if we'll get through this. And now here we are all these months later, and things are just dragging on in this state of crisis. And I think it really is settling in for people in terms of their personal experience of like, yep, this is what's normal now, is this kind of prolonged state of crisis. You check the news every day, you hope for something that's going to be, we figured out a solution, and that doesn't happen. The money the government needs to get to you isn't coming, the vaccine isn't there yet, the election isn't fair. We are all just living in this prolonged state of crisis. So I don't see a way that, we go back to the way things used to be. Out of the scenarios that you talked about, obviously, the closest one to that would be the first scenario, right? Which would be that we get some sort of massive reform overhaul that would, intervene in this form of crises. And I think you're correct to really point to, like, the New Deal as, like, sort of a historical parallel to what that would be. And that is, the people who want that sort of thing point to the New Deal as well. And that is just a world that, like you said, really, if there was a representative of that possibility, it was probably Bernie, right? And sort of that wing of the progressive Democrats. And we saw in this election that, the more moderate Democratic forces will not let that happen. Right? Bernie was killing it in the primaries early on, and in this sense, you can't fault them. It's politics. They're playing politics. He got outplayed by the centrists, who consolidated their power at the urging of Obama behind Biden, and were able to oust Bernie from the conversation entirely. So, the opposition to that exists politically is very difficult. What it would take for that world to happen, kind of like the only thing I could imagine would have to be the constitution of a new political party, right? Like, that is really what it would have to be. And that could happen, who knows, right? Like, I really do think, like, if there's ever a time when we get past the two parties, the wake of this election might be that time, because I think there will be so much illegitimacy, so much anger, that we might really finally just see that break happen. But even then, whether or not it could succeed in creating a coalition and taking, power through an election is a whole other question. So that is the most optimistic, the most possible return to normal, and there are definitely people who support that and want that really badly, but the opposition on both, like, the Republican and the Democrat side really makes it hard for me to believe that that's sort of an outcome that we could see. In terms of your second outcome, I think I lean towards the second outcome being the most likely, sort of the balkanization side of things. I think we will see, essentially, the federal government continue to just punt crises to the state. That's what we saw with coronavirus right now under Trump, where it became very clear that the states were going to have to take their own actions. We were not going to get a unified national response that would take sort of the collective actions necessary to prevent the virus from spinning totally out of control. So I think that, in all likelihood, we're looking at, a similar scenario in future crises. I don't think that Biden would be any fundamentally different, right? There is opposition to spending on that sort of thing in general, and I think that Biden has not shown himself to be the kind of Democrat who's interested in big collective federal projects, right? He's not even supporting Medicare for all. There's just defend the ACA is kind of their approach to things. So, in my opinion, more likely what we're going to see is that sort of balkanization approach where things are punted to the states and they're forced to take things in their own direction, and that I think will weaken sort of the coherence of the federal government in a lot of ways. What that looks like long term can be equally scary to the other scenarios, I think. I keep thinking about a book that I would recommend to everyone, actually, a sci-fi book that gets at, I think, a very shockingly potential reality of the future would be Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. And Parable of the Sower has like an interesting view of state balkanization, where like states also balkanize in terms of who has access to what resources based on climate change, and that would be my other big concern, right? You know, you think about some places like Southern California that has tens of millions of people living there, but doesn't actually have its own water, right? That has to be brought in externally from the other parts of the state, from the Colorado River, from neighboring states. And there are a lot of places in the US where that exists. You think about how, for example, like Phoenix could exist without bringing things in from other parts of the country, or a lot of desert states. And the balkanization concern that I would have in that regard would be that we will see some states really just fall into disrepair as climate crisis continues without any aid from either other states or the federal government. And to me, that I think is probably what's most likely, is that the US continues to sort of limp on sort of through these crises. Nothing gets fixed and things of, you know, sort of just decay. I think if that is the route that we end up going down, which, you know, again, if I had to put money on it, I would put money on it, that probably eventually leads to that third potential option that you talked about. You know, once you have that level of balkanization, I think that creates the condition for competing power forces to really start to fight it out. You know, and again, like when you're talking about civil war, that's not the idea of like a union versus confederacy thing. You can listen to like the Boogaloo people and all of them, and that's not what they're talking about when they're talking about a civil war. They're talking about this desire for just violence going in multiple directions. The podcast that, you know, talks about this, and that many of you have probably already listened to, obviously, would be It Could Happen Here, wherein Robert Evans lays out his claim for why a possible civil war should not be ruled out as a possibility in the United States. And that is kind of what he emphasizes, is when he says, when I talk about a possible civil war, I'm not talking about like secession versus the government. I'm talking about something like Syria, where there's 7 factions and constantly shifting allegiances and coalitions. It's not always clear who's on whose side, and it's sort of more a general breakdown.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that, yeah, man, it sucks to say, but that is probably the most likely direction that things are going in. I don't think the reform approach is really, you know, there. I don't think that that can happen. And then that fourth option, could some sort of revolutionary movement create a fundamental overhaul of the system? We'd all like to think so, you know, and that is definitely, you know, we want to build for a totally new world, but I think we have to be prepared for the possibility of how do we survive that second and third scenario.
Yeah.
Because I think that, you know, those are things that are on the table and that we have to deal with. And for me, that is part of why I think it's important that, you know, all the work that we do is about building mass movements of community collective survival, right? So the reason that I think mutual aid matters, the reason that I think community defense matters, the reason that I think, you know, bail funds and these things matter, is they pull communities together. And in a world where balkanization is occurring and where political violence is occurring, having those, you know, networks already there for you and your community of people who are exploited and oppressed in various ways by this society to be able to survive collectively rather than individual is a really crucial project. And one reason that I think that whatever types of mass work are happening right now, they have to have the dual purpose of building a broader movement, but also creating an infrastructure to survive should things go in those much, much worse directions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's all very, very insightful. And I think what you did there, which I think is correct, is to sort of put pressure on the boundaries that I set out between these 4 distinct paths and really thinking it more of like, how does one bleed into another? So if we do have balkanization, which is pretty much synonymous with social collapse on some level, then we could still have something like the Civil War, but not the unified government repression, right? And then in a scenario where you have something like a protracted, ongoing, scattered civil war in a context of balkanization, you would have revolutionary formations and fascist ones and everything in between. I think, like you said, you know, 7 different formations trying to work together or form coalitions or whatever. So yeah, I think those all come down. And then, you know, just the sort of dialectical progress, you know, in the face of repression comes the dialectical response of resisting that repression. And, you know, so you can never have just one without the other. One will always bring on the other. A revolution will always bring on a backlash. Fascism will always bring on resistance. And so those things really can't be separated. One thing I do want to say, and then we can move on to the next subject, and perhaps it's even related, but I really want us to think deeply about what's happening right now to the psychology of Americans. And it's always been true that humans adapt, and it's been scary to see how quickly Americans have adapted to things over the past few years. I mean, before Trump was elected, we laughed at the idea. Like, it's really hard to get back into that mindset of 2015 when Trump comes down that elevator and we're just mocking the fuck out of him. Memes are being made. Like, nobody on the left or the right thought it was ever a possibility until the fucking day. And Trump came out to give his acceptance speech, red face, looked like he just got, fucking shot or something. Like, he was fucking surprised by it. But what happened? We adapted to it, and now it's just the new normal. And then we had the coronavirus, and it's like, holy shit, a pandemic. This will bring us together, right? Nope. We just adapted to it. Almost 180,000 dead Americans, and they're saying the most expert estimates are saying, by the time this is all said and done, we're looking at 300,000 American deaths. Over the last 4 months, we've seen more Americans die than at any other 4-month period in American history. And a recent poll came out testing independents, Dems, and Republicans about is 170, 180,000 Americans an acceptable loss of life for what we're going through. And 57% of Republicans said, yes, it's an acceptable amount of death. And what's really happening here is that all of us, regardless of what side we're on, we are being conditioned to accept mass death. And if we can be conditioned to accept mass death and accept it and be okay with it and even have half the country fervently defend it, what is it going to look like when climate change fully wraps its hand around our throat? This is a prelude to climate change. We've talked about coronavirus as a test run for other pandemics or other crises in the future. But the underbelly of that is that it's desensitizing us to losing that many Americans. We lost 3,000 Americans on 9/11 and went to war forever and had the whole country come together, ready to just, pave the fucking planet in response to 3,000 dead Americans. And then now these patriots are saying that 188,000 dead fellow Americans is an acceptable loss of life. Things fucking change, and we are being conditioned to accept it. When we say America is a death cult, when we talk about understanding America through the lens of necro-capitalism, we're getting at this general idea. And it's sort of becoming now a part of capitalist realism, is this acceptance that for capitalism to continue on, we have to be okay with countless fucking people, even our own neighbors, dying. When it's the Iraq War, when it's 100,000, a million innocent civilians in some other country, whatever, Americans are okay with it. But we always said, well, if they brought that amount of death here, no way Americans would be okay with it. Yeah, they are. The bloody children of empire are totally fine with it. They don't give a fuck. And that should scare us more than most things that we're scared about right now.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that is sort of like a big thing that this comes down to, is that people just, this sort of what I was trying to get at, is like the urgency and fear that we felt at the beginning of this feels gone. And that's that sort of adaptation that I think is scary, right? Like, people have just kind of come to accept that this is where we're at. And that's not a great position to be in, and not really where we want to be in terms of things. And so, I find it hard to be hopeful about the future in terms of that. And it is that those numbers of the amount of Republicans who find that to be an acceptable number is just absolutely astounding and terrifying to think about. But, here we are, and we have to do what we have to do. And like I said, for me, like, my perspective is that what is very important is that we make sure that the organizing that's getting done also builds the conditions for survival. Yes. Because no matter what scenario we end up in, survival is going to be a necessary perspective. And I think in America, there's this overwhelming culture of individual survivalism that has to be pushed back against. And this focus on what community infrastructure for survival looks like is really what needs to be developed. And a lot of the projects that the left is doing, I think, move in that direction, and that's what's so hopeful about them. So it's my hope that, that can be the hope that we have during these moments when things look admittedly quite bleak.
Yeah. On the collective level, we have to organize, build bridges, politically educate. It has to be happening right now to lay the foundations to survive whatever's coming next. On the individual level, I would also urge people to try to consciously build skills. What skills will become increasingly necessary, in your opinion, over the next several years? And then try to figure out what of those skills you could reasonably develop, and then just start working on them. And that could be something you do in your free time. You don't need to bring anybody else into it. You don't need to steer, crucial organizing in that direction. But on an individual level, you can take that responsibility. It's something I've been doing for many years with learning how to hunt and to fish and to survive in the outdoors, not because I believe that we're going to be in some Mad Max scenario. And in fact, I think preppers who are so hyper individualistic that they think they're going to survive with them and their families in a post-apocalyptic landscape fundamentally overlook the utter importance of community. It's not going to be bands of individual families fighting it out over their property. It's going to be communities coming together and doing things collectively, because we're fucking human beings and we evolved as social animals. And when times get hard, we're going to go back, even in a hyper-individual society, we're going to go back to communal forms of living. And so laying the framework for that is essential. And then what you can contribute to that individually is also something I really think that's worth thinking about.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with that skills perspective. Like, it's not you're going to be out in a cave somewhere living on your own, but what skills can you bring to a community during a time of crises? And the ability to grow food, gather food, be able to bring those skills is what's going to be really crucial. And I think that is something that we need to invest in and that we need to be thinking about. And again, like I want like a collective vision of what survival means as opposed to that individualist prepper one. And that is something that I think that we really need to develop.
Absolutely.
The other big thing that I want to talk about is obviously very related to these questions of survival and these questions of crises is the issue of climate change. Because I think, climate change is something that we talk about a lot on this show, that Brett and I both really emphasize, because it represents such an intense crisis for capitalism and such a thing that it's sort of unclear how capitalism could possibly overcome. But I think for a lot of people living in the United States right now, climate change is something that's being felt very, very acutely, right? Every year we have these natural disasters, but there are some that are very, very, very intense in their scale this year that I just kind of wanted to point out and wrestle with in terms of us thinking through the moment of crises that we're in. So one that got not a lot of news coverage, actually, was, I don't know if it's pronounced Derecho or Derecho, I'm not sure the correct pronunciation, but it's basically an inland hurricane that tore through the Midwest and devastated Iowa especially. And looking at some of the images from what that hurricane did is absolutely incredible, just ripping houses apart, downed trees all over the place, and huge amounts of the Midwest without power for days on end, and it just did not get that much news attention. But, I think this is another example of what sort of these increase in weathers look like. Who has heard the term for that kind of inland hurricane before? I had never heard it, but it's probably a term we're going to become more familiar with. And we're seeing the intense devastation that is coming from that in a place that, that is not necessarily where you would expect to see that kind of weather problem. The bright side of it is that we've also seen people pull together in response to that. Groups have formed of people getting rid of fallen trees, helping clear areas where there were downed power lines. And so again, we are seeing collective communal responses where the state has failed to respond properly in time, but it is just an example of how intense the crisis is at the moment. Over in California, the last week has been absolutely fucking absurd in terms of weather. California got hit with a very intense heat wave that put a lot of the state above 100-degree weather, and at the same time had a slate of dry lightning storms that sparked an incredible amount of wildfires. And California, which is always prone to wildfires, is now looking at way, way, way more fires than we have ever seen before. A historic amount of the state is burning up from those dry lightning strikes, and that also led to the collapse of the energy infrastructure to a large degree because people were not able to get the energy they needed, and rolling blackouts plagued the state throughout the last week, which is something that now people are talking about becoming a more regular occurrence during the summer. So the failure of the energy grid infrastructure. And then on top of that, the crisis is compounded in California by the fact that the California government does not largely pay firefighters to go out and fight these wildfires. They use inmates to do it, who receive very little money, a few dollars a day usually, to go out and fight these wildfires. And because of the compounding of the COVID crisis leading to massive infections within the prison system in California, there aren't firefighters to go out and fight these fires. And we are seeing a three-way sort of crises where there's a crisis within the correction system because of the pandemic. There is a crisis of the fires themselves and the weather that is changing and being promoted by climate change. And then a crisis of the energy grid, which is leading to people not having power, putting them in danger of heat because they can't run air conditioning at their house. And I think it is just such a brutal example of how something like climate change can just really interrupt life on the whole. California was kind of shut down for a week because of all of this that was going on, and we are barely into the beginning of the worst effects that we're going to see of climate change, and things are going to get much, much worse going forward. And so I think it's important that all of us who sort of, are seeing this right now, take it seriously as a wake-up call that, like, these very intense events that we're seeing are a light version of what we will be seeing in the future. And it can just serve as a wake-up call for how dire things are going to get, and the way that crises can compound on top of each other, leading to more and more complex crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, earlier this month, the last fully intact ice shelf in Canada collapsed. It was 4,000 years old. It lost 43% of its area in just 2 days. I saw an image from the Gulf of Mexico during basically a tropical storm down there that you had 5 to 7 water spouts, water tornadoes occurring at once all up and down the coastline. The wildfires in Australia during our winter, right? And then now it's our summer, so now California is back on fire. These huge tornadoes. Me and my son here in Nebraska were just a couple of years ago in a tornado that devastated the neighborhood right next to us, and we had to we were living in an apartment on the 3rd floor, had to go down and knock on the first floor. It's a random apartment to see if we can take cover. So it's not like, this just happens in certain areas. Everybody is prone to this stuff. The flooding here has been historic. We're talking about the possibility of 2 hurricanes hitting at once now. I think one has been downgraded to a tropical storm as of now, but who knows how that will exactly play out. And even if it doesn't happen this time, the fact that there's now a possibility of 2 hurricanes converging on the same basic area of the United States hitting at once is, absolutely just mind-boggling.
Right.
And what this represents overall is really a sort of outstripping of many of the models that science had even just a few years ago. Science has an inbuilt bias towards sort of being conservative in their estimates and, playing the odds. And so a lot of those models are sort of conservative models, and they're saying now in many areas of those models, they're being outstripped by actual events. Events that are happening right around now that they didn't think necessarily would happen until maybe several decades down the road. So that means climate change is going to happen faster than we thought. It's going to be more intense than we thought. The government's response to COVID is going to just be just a prelude to the non-response coming from these other crises. And then, as we've talked about many, many times on this show and others, multiple crises at once. That could take the form of multiple climate crises, but it could, just be a situation of like a pandemic. And then let's say, historical racial protests. And then, 2 hurricanes hit at once on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, and the states delegitimized through voting just absurdities that drag on for many months, and nobody's sure who actually won. You're talking about a real breaking point for our entire society. And this stuff is not hyperbolic. It's not just the fever dreams of radicals on the fringes of American politics. This is stuff that, we on the left have been screaming about for years, often to deaf ears all along the rest of the political spectrum. And now we're finally seeing it come to fruition. And it's fucking horrifying. I have young children. This is their future. This is their lives. This isn't just about I'm scared for myself. It's not about me. It's about the next generation. It's about other human beings. And, that really what it comes down to now for me is, how can I use my life to help others, to serve others, to protect others, to nurture and heal others, and how can we come together as human beings to really be a force for good in a decaying and very evil world. That's sort of what is now our responsibility as sort of decent, wide-eyed human beings that have a sober grasp of the situation, that haven't flung themselves into conspiracy fever dream fantasy lands, but actually take a sober look at reality and look in what you see staring back is the barrel of a gun.
Right.
It's a horrifying sort of turn of events, and I don't have much more to say than that. Going back to organizing, building skills, these things are coming to a climax where there is no normal to return to. And, the formations, political and social, that prepare for it, that lay the groundwork for being able to keep communities together during these onslaughts, no matter from what direction they come from, are going to be the ones that adapt and come out the best on the other end. And we really have to start laying those foundations.
Right. And I think the thing to really emphasize, right, in terms of these compounding crises and the way they function, is that the thing that we've learned and that you need to internalize, even if it sucks to admit, is that no one is coming to save you if you're not willing to organize to save yourself and your community, right? That's what we're seeing with COVID. The state is not going to be there when it needs to be there. Even living in a state that has handled things fairly well, it has not really intervened in a way that has stopped people from being evicted, has not intervened in a way that stopped people people from going potentially broke, facing hunger, facing poverty, facing the street. Even liberal states are seeing those problems. And looking at these climate crises, no states are taking the kind of actions they could need to prevent future climate change from happening. And so the thing that you need to accept, and that is hard to accept, and I hope we can recognize, is that we as the working class, as the masses, have to have our own back and have to take into our own hands the ability to care for each other and to create collective action. And that means all sorts of things, but a huge part of it is those skills we said. Can you feed your community? Can your community produce food? Can it take care of itself? These are questions that you're gonna have to start to learn to answer with a yes, because it is very, very clear that no external help is coming in that regard. And that is a, terrifying thing to face down. Like Brett said, it's staring down the barrel of a gun in a sense, but it also ought to be hopefully inspiring, right? It gives a task at hand that can be taken up and that can be done. And in the face of crisis, that means not giving in to nihilism or just look how bad the world is, not giving in towards just overwhelming defeat, but trying to think how it opens the opportunity to build something better. And that's what needs to be done right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, everybody, thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting the show. As we said, next month we'll come back with a more theory-oriented episode, but it's not going to be like we've done in the past where we cover a text. Instead, this time we're really going to focus on building a resource for people coming to the left that want to understand Marxism, want to understand what we mean by imperialism, want to understand what we mean by having a structural approach to problems instead of an individualistic one, etc. I've seen some people on Twitter just this week. I think there's this young, probably late teens girl who just asked, "Hey, I'm really interested in socialism, but I have no idea where to start." And like the first 4 comments were like Red Menace and Rev Left Radio, and of course there were many others as well. But insofar as we have a platform, we have responsibility, and insofar as lots of young people are coming and looking for these answers, we feel like we are positioned to offer that resource. And even though you, as somebody who might be on the left for a very long time, who've dove into all these deep texts with us, might not need that 101, we're giving it to you so that you can turn around and hand it off to somebody else who might not even know our show exists. But you operate in organizing circles, or younger people coming up who are interested. That's who we're making it for. So even if it doesn't appeal to you directly, listen to it and take it to the people that you need to take it to help spread the word and make these young people coming in as educated as they possibly can, because we know what political action looks like without political education. It's chaotic, it's unorganized, people get hurt, and it doesn't really lead to the sort of long-term solutions that we need. So political education is an essential pillar of any sort of future organized political activity that leads toward a better world. And so we have to take that part seriously as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, everybody stay safe out there, organize, love one another, and we'll be back next month.